So my name is Chase Windish, and I research the impact of political ideology on one's perception of bias in the American mainstream media. So there's really one event that served as a launch pad for this research project, and those were the events of January 6, 2021. And I'm not going to get into the politics of the issue, but what concerned me was the fact that multiple news sources reported completely different pieces of information and cited them as factual. And this is concerning because Americans are getting different information that is labeled as accurate. And because these news organizations are catering to a certain political audience, are we still able to take in and interpret accurate reporting if it's not sugarcoated in language that aligns with our own political beliefs? So according to Gallup, Americans' trust in the media is at its lowest point since 2016. And this is very well caused by, it's very likely to be caused by the political polarization of the news sources that have further divided Americans with opposing political beliefs. And this could lead to Americans disbelieving in news that they hear just because the news is coming from a source that doesn't seem reputable to them or that aligns with their own political ideologies. So before we get into it, just a couple of terms that I think is worth identifying. The first is oppositional media hostility, which is where a consumer of a given news article or source of some kind believes that it's unnecessarily biased against their own views, and it causes them to show particular hostility towards that source. And selective exposure, which is where people will only consume news from sources that affirm and bolster their own political beliefs rather than challenging or reporting things from an objective point of view. So getting into my literature review, my first research paper that I looked into was called The Role of Political Identity and Media Selection on Perceptions of Hostile Media Bias During the 2012 Presidential Campaign by Mei-Chen Lin, Paul M. Heridakis, and Gary Hansen. And so basically, participants were subjected to different forms of media, so like TV sources, social networking sites, radio channels, video sharing platforms, etc. And these were all reporting on a presidential debate from the 2012 presidential campaign. And basically, people who felt that their political party was viewed as inferior, even if it was objectively portrayed, if their party was shown as losing or whatnot, deemed the media coverage of the 2012 presidential campaign to be completely biased against their party, and they showed signs of hostile media bias or oppositional media hostility. My next source is called Evaluating the News, Misperceptions of Objectivity and Credibility by Dimitri Kelly. And basically, what he did was give subjects a balanced, unbiased source from a site that they were not aware of. And people thought it was biased because the information that was being presented to them did not phrase things in the way that they were used to hearing on their normal media sites where they normally consume information from. And what he found through his research was that people are inclined to sort themselves into partisan news if given the option, even if given the option to consume just pure objective information, because people want to hear what bolsters their current beliefs. And he found that the media has expanded and moved away from objectively reporting information and news stories, and they've moved toward biased and tailored articles and information so they can gain viewership from certain groups. My next source is called Inequality and Bias in the Demand for and Supply of News, and this is by Ann L. Owen and Andrew Way. And basically, they basically analyzed just a large chunk of data, and they found that political affiliations can have an impact on personal bias in the mass media. And in particular, they found that people with conservative political ideologies, they tended to seek a more individualistic news source, and they found that potentially that people with conservative ideologies exhibit more confirmation bias and selective exposure than other political ideologies. My next important source is called Polarized Political Communication, Oppositional Media Hostility, and Selective Exposure by Kevin Arsenault, Martin Johnson, and Chad Murphy. And basically, they gave subjects partisan news and partisan articles to read. And they found that subjects who did not have articles that align with their own political beliefs showed extreme oppositional media hostility. And they found that the reason that oppositional media hostility is not such a large problem is due to another problem, which is equally as important, is selective exposure, is that people are just sorting themselves into news that don't challenge their ways of thinking And so people are just consuming media that just affirms their already held beliefs. And then lastly, we have congenial public, contrary press, and biased estimates of the climate of opinion. And this is by Albert Gunter, Lindy Christian, Janice Liebhardt, and Stella Chin-Yun Chia. And basically this focused around public opinion about the use of primates in lab research and how the hostile media perception, and they looked into the hostile media perception, persuasive press inference, and projection bias around that field. And they found that people with strong political opinions on certain issues, they tend to think that the media is more biased than people with a more neutral stance. And then they also found that the opinions of leaders in our society have a major impact on people's lives. For example, like President Trump with his claims of fake news and in the conservative press. So moving into my methodology, so I chose to conduct a case study. I was initially leaning towards correlational research, but my test kind of centered around a more general, a more broad lens, and so it wasn't narrow enough to necessarily conduct a correlational research where two specific things, how they relate to one another. And because of this wide range of factors and variables that that went into my study, case studies seemed like the best option because it's looking into why a certain trend exists. And so to conduct my research, I conducted a survey and distributed it out. And basically it had three main parts. So the first section was just some baseline information. And here I asked, I asked participants whether they believe that bias exists in the media, if it favors one side, if it means conservative, liberal, if it's a threat to society, etc. And I did this kind of just to get a baseline of just the general common consensus of the participants before I exposed them to any sources. And then what I did was I provided excerpts from articles, one from a conservative-aligned news source and one from a liberal-aligned news source. So I used Newsmax and CNN respectively. And I basically asked them to identify if they believed it was biased or not. The articles were specifically how President Trump's actions were portrayed in the events of January 6th. And so I asked them if they believed that the article presented former President Trump as in a fair manner. And then from there, I also asked them to rate their perceived accuracy of the information in each source on a scale of 1 to 5, so 1 being completely inaccurate, 5 being completely accurate. And then after that, I asked for some demographic information, so like age, political alignment, political activity, how often they consume the news, things like that to help me get a general idea of the test and who I'm getting results from. So now going into some results. So some general findings that are important just to list off the bat is that 96 and this is kind of more from my initial questions that I asked just for the baseline. And basically 96.7% of people believe that bias exists within the American mainstream media. 70.3% of people believe that the bias favors one particular side, and that's coming from both conservatives and liberals. They believe that the bias does favor a side. And 79.9% of people believe that the bias in the media is a major threat to our society. So now going into more of the specifics. So on the whole, conservatives tend to believe that there is more bias present than liberals, and they believe that 43.9% of respondents believe that the bias favored liberals, and 34.7% believe that it favored conservatives, as shown here by these two graphs, or these two pie charts. So this is an example of the graphs that show when participants were asked to rate the veracity of the articles that were presented. And so 1 being completely inaccurate and 5 being completely accurate. And it's interesting that it showed that both articles actually had almost a very, very similar spread in terms of the data. Another important thing to mention is that of the participants that took the survey, most of them did not keep up with the news very often, and so there was and then also a lot of the participants were not politically active, which is another key thing to identify. So moving into what does this all mean? So basically almost everybody believes that there is media bias, and I think that the 2016 elections served as a real catalyst of this. And it's found that media sites, they tailor their stories to affect the target audience. And this isn't new, but this is kind of the first time that this has been used as a real political weapon to put down other sides and to spread disinformation and to hurt the other political side. And most people believe that the bias favors the opposing political party. And so this aligns with what Gunter and his peers were saying in their research study, which shows that regardless of your political alignment, a lot of people do believe that the bias favors the other side. And people also believe that people exhibited strong perceptions of bias in the media, even when not heavily involved in the political process, which was shown as like from some of those other slides. And so this can lead to some of the outside sources of political socialization, like parents and peers and stuff, and how people are more influenced by them as opposed to actually forming their own political beliefs, and how ideologies can take over before critical thinking really steps in. Another thing that I'd like to dive deeper into is that a lot of my respondents consume news from completely unregulated sources, and so this is easier to practice selective exposure and confirmation bias when sources are unregulated, because they can basically report on anything, so you can pretty much find anything online that aligns with your own beliefs. And so it's very easy to find mis and disinformation on unregulated sources, and it's dangerous to consume this kind of media as your only source of media, because of the fact that a lot of the information, it can be completely inaccurate, and we've seen from things such as Infowars and some other sources and like that. Most people are also centrist in terms of their political ideologies. So this can be also described by those two graphs that I was showing them when I was asked them to rate the accuracy of the information from both excerpts. And they showed that both had the same spread, which shows that most people are generally kind of skeptical of what they read. And the largest portion was the 3 range, which is kind of right in the middle. And then it also shows here just one of my demographic questions, that most of the people were either fully centrist or left centrist or right centrist. And then really the main finding was that from the information from my results, I found that that conservatives had a higher perception of bias in the media. And so this could be caused by a number of factors. One of them could be because of the term fake news. It's been used. We've seen it used as more of a political weapon, more by conservative media to attack other forms of media than any other forms of media, and this can kind of be caused to sway the target audience. And we've also shown, like what Owen and Wade were saying in their study, they found that people with conservative ideologies, they tend to seek out news outlets that align with their own beliefs rather than other areas of the political spectrum. And so this kind of aligns with the fact that in the past, people with conservative ideologies have tended to show a little bit more of confirmation bias. So some limitations on the study were a lot of the respondents were not politically active and did not keep up with the news, and a lot of this is the nature that most of my respondents were from the Brophy College Prep School. And I think that these people, their political ideologies were not fully developed, so it was kind of more the political ideologies of maybe their friends or their other areas of influence, like their parents. And more conservative respondents were present than liberal respondents, so that could also kind of show us maybe why they're deemed more biased in the liberal media than the conservative media. And then for some future research, so one area is why conservatives tend to have a greater perception of bias in the media, and so it'd be interesting to have more concrete evidence, because I was kind of just identifying if there was one that had a greater perception of bias, and so really diving deeper into why that is. And then maybe also some of the implications of the media bias and using the media as a political weapon, and how that, what are the implications of that on the common person, on the average American? Because it's been used to instill division, and it's greatly polarized the American people. Thank you.
Terrific, thanks Chase. Okay, I got a few questions for you before you finish up. So for the first one, how did your review of methods early on influence and kind of control how you did your research? Tell us a little bit about that review of methods and your choices.
So a lot of people that from the research that I was reviewing in my research study, they did conduct kind of a case study where they did expose people to trends, and they tried to identify trends in terms of like media bias, and that kind of had an impact on what I was trying to do, because I loosely modeled my study off of some of the studies that I had identified in my research project by exposing participants to different sources and then seeing kind of how they reacted and drawing conclusions from that. So yeah.
Terrific. And then you talked a little bit about directions for future research. How do your findings specifically lead to that curiosity about future research?
So my findings kind of laid the groundwork of, like, I've identified this trend where I believe that people with conservative ideologies tend to have a greater perception of bias. And so really diving deeper into why that is, like maybe some of the factors like that I've identified, but even further, that could lead to future research and that I personally find very interesting.
Okay. And then finally, the final question, what was the most important research skill that you developed as part of this process? And what else do you think you can apply that skill to?
Yeah, so I would say the most important research skill, I think, is using the work, taking what other people did, and then applying that to what I was doing and using that to bolster my own argument. And I think that's important for any future research papers or anything just to increase my credibility in the future. Is what taking people have already done, and by using that in conjunction with what I'm doing to make a fully well-rounded research argument or research paper.